All right, so today we're tackling a topic with, well, a whole lot of history behind it. Decolonization in the 20th century. And, you bring us The Age of Extremes by Eric Hobsbawm. And honestly, the title alone has me wondering, like, how much upheaval can you pack into one century? Empires crumbling, power shifting. Where do we even start?
Well, you hit the nail on the head there. Upheaval is a good word for it. What's so fascinating about Hobsbawm's view is how he brings in these voices that don't always make it into the, grand narratives of history, the colonized people themselves. He doesn't just tell us empires fell apart. He gets into why it felt like, well, almost inevitable to so many people living through it.
Right. It's like we know the Titanic sank, but Hobsbawm takes us below deck, right? He shows us the cracks that were forming long before that iceberg even hit. So set the scene for us. What's the world look like before those cracks become impossible to ignore?
Okay, so imagine early 1900s, world dominated by a handful of nations, mostly Western. We're not even just talking land, it's resources, entire economies, cultures, all being pushed towards a very specific model. Hobsbawm argues that progress, that very idea itself, meant becoming more Western.
Wow, it's like even the concept of progress was, in a way, colonized. But surely there had to be exceptions, places resisting this.
Yeah, you do see flickers of difference. Hobsbawm points to Russia, for example, after that 1917 revolution. Soviet communism offered a potential alternative path, right? But even there, he argues that the goal was still catching up with the West, just on their own terms.
It's amazing how ingrained that model was, almost like everyone was playing the same game, just with slightly different rules. And then, boom, World War I explodes. And this supposedly stable world order is, well, anything by T stable. But was it really challenging the entire system itself, or was it just a really, really nasty fight within the existing one?
That's the question Hobsbawm goes for, I think. On the surface, yeah, clash of empires. But he argues that this war, it was like the first really audible crack in the facade, the sheer brutality of it, how global the fighting became. It exposed a fragility in these empires that hadn't really been visible before, especially for the British Empire, so reliant on its colonies.
And you can't talk about cracks in the coalition without talking about India, right? Hobsbawm spends a lot of time on that Indian independence movement and Gandhi's role specifically, which it's kind of mind-blowing, right? How one man's ideas could have such a huge impact.
Oh, Gandhi was a once-in-a-century figure, no doubt, and Hobsbawm acknowledges that. His whole approach, that nonviolent resistance, it was revolutionary, not just politically, but morally, too. It exposed this hypocrisy at the heart of these empires. How can you preach enlightenment while also justifying this level of brutality?
Right, but it wasn't just about exposing hypocrisy. Gandhi tapped into something deeper, something that millions of Indians connected with on a, well, almost spiritual level, didn't he?
Totally. And this is where Hobsbawm gets really interesting, I think. He points out that while Gandhi's vision was for a modern, unified India, many of his followers, they connected with his message on this really deep religious level.
So even within the independence movement, there were different visions of what a post-colonial India would actually look like.
Exactly. And that tension, right, between embracing modernity while also holding on to tradition. It's a huge theme Hobsbawm explores because you have these ancient societies, these deeply rooted traditions, suddenly thrust into a global system that, well, let's be honest, the West largely created. Of course there's going to be friction.
Yeah, it's like trying to force a square peg into a round hole, isn't it? You can try to make it fit, but it's never going to be pretty. And then, as if those cultural and political tensions weren't enough, bam, the Great Depression hits. Not exactly a recipe for a smooth transition of power, is it?
You said it. The 1930s, globally, just turbulent times. But what's crucial here is how the Depression exposed the fault lines in the global economy itself. And you see how precariously a lot of the colonized world was balanced on this very uneven playing field, right? When the West's economies tanked, those colonies forced to rely on exporting raw materials, well, it was catastrophic for them.
Oh, it's this cruel irony, isn't it? Just as this desire for self-determination is gaining momentum, this economic earthquake hits, and it makes breaking free from those imperial structures even harder.
And this dependence wasn't accidental either. Hobsbawm really digs into this, how colonial powers actively prevented their colonies from developing their own, diverse industries. He even uses this example, Portugal, long history of canned goods, wine, etc. But they never industrialized at the same scale as other European nations. Why? Because they were so reliant on colonial exports, it stunted their growth in other areas.
It's like they were stuck on a hamster wheel, running and running, but not actually getting anywhere. So you have this growing unrest, the economic turmoil, and then, well, World War II. Another war, on the surface at least, between empires. What did Hobsbawm see as the fundamental shift this time around?
This time, it wasn't just about fighting the war itself. It was like the whole world was holding its breath, you know?
Mm.
Because underneath it all, the tanks, the ideologies, there was this growing feeling that things couldn't just go back to how they were before. Hobsbawm argues that winning the war, it wasn't just victory, it was this realization. The colonized world, they had other options now.
Options. Okay, sure, the old empires were hurting, but who else was there? It's
Right.
not like the U.S. and the Soviets were exactly, handing out independence pamphlets.
True, but both of them, they represented something different than that old order. You had the US, especially with Roosevelt, they at least talked about anti-colonialism, right? And then the Soviet Union, their whole deal was basically a giant "we're not the West" sign. Suddenly, playing nice with your colonizer, it wasn't the only path to progress.
So it's this weird side effect of the Cold War almost. While they're busy being rivals, the U.S. and USSR accidentally give these independence movements a boost just by, well, existing.
It's this fascinating dynamic Hobsbawm picks up on. These new superpowers, they need allies, right? Influence. And that gives colonized people leverage they never had before. Imagine being a leader in, say, Africa, parts of Asia during this time. You could play these superpowers off each other, force them to earn your support.
Whoa, talk about high-stakes diplomacy. But this is all pretty theoretical, right? How did any of this play out in reality? We're talking about empires that had ruled for centuries. How do you even begin to dismantle something that entrenched?
It was messy, that's for sure. And it varied wildly depending where you looked. Some transitions, they were relatively peaceful, like when Britain finally left India in 47. Even that, though, and Hobsbawm gets into this, it wasn't without its bloodshed.
Right, the partition of India and Pakistan, incredibly violent. It's a reminder that even when empires crumble, the human cost is almost always, well, enormous.
Tragic lesson, and sadly one that gets repeated a lot in the 20th century. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the French in Indochina. They clung on with this, I don't know, desperation almost that really backfired.
It's like they missed the memo everyone else was reading. Why were the French so dead set on holding on to their empire, even as, like, the writing was on the wall?
Hobsbawm argues that for the French Empire, it wasn't just about, some far-off land they controlled. It was an extension of France itself, tied up with their national identity. Not just colonialism, but a civilizing mission, even if that mission was, often brutal and self-serving.
So a dangerous mix of pride and, like, a really unhealthy dose of paternalism.
Exactly. And what did it lead to? The First Indochina War, which culminates in their defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 54. That loss, it wasn't just military, it was symbolic. This blow to the whole idea of French grandeur.
It's crazy how much can hinge on a single battle like that, how it becomes this turning point in history. And with Indochina, the story didn't end with the French leaving, did it?
Sadly, no. The U.S. steps in, terrified of the domino effect, communism spreading, and well. We know how that turned out in Vietnam. It's a dark example of how Cold War anxieties, they took these local struggles for independence and turned them into proxy wars with just devastating, long-lasting consequences.
It makes you realize how interconnected everything was during this period. You couldn't separate decolonization from the Cold War, from the global economy, from these clashing ideologies. It's a lot.
Exactly, and Hobsbawm connects those dots masterfully, I think. He argues that while World War II, yeah, was the catalyst, it was actually the economic realities of the post-war world that really, truly sealed the fate of these empires.
Because, well, rebuilding after a world war, that's expensive. Even empires have their limits.
Right, and more than that, the whole economic balance of power was in flux. Europe, they're exhausted in ruins. They don't have the resources to maintain these sprawling empires anymore. Even Britain, as huge as their holdings were, they realized that holding on could bankrupt them.
So it was this perfect storm almost. You have the internal pressure from these independence movements, a weakened Europe that can't really push back the same way anymore, and this new global order where maintaining empires just doesn't make economic sense.
Exactly. It was like watching a house of cards collapse. One thing knocks into another, and suddenly the whole structure is coming down.
And the wreckage of it all, you've got all these newly independent nations trying to figure out, well,
Yeah.
now what?
That's a part of this period that often gets overlooked, I think. Everyone focuses on the empires falling apart, but what about the challenge of actually building something new in their place? Especially when those new nations were often based on borders drawn by, their former colonizers, with little regard for existing ethnic or cultural realities on the ground.
It's like being handed a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces don't even quite fit right,
Yeah.
and then being told to create a masterpiece. And then on top of that, they're also trying to navigate this whole new global order, this tug of war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
Exactly. And that's where Hobsbawm's work really shines, I think. He doesn't just chronicle the fall of empires, he dives into the really messy, complicated, often contradictory experiences of the people who actually lived through it all.
So let's get into the specifics of that. We've talked about India, Indochina, but what about the rest of the world? How did this play out in other parts of Asia, in Africa?
Africa is especially interesting, right? Last continent to be colonized, and therefore the last to really break free. And what's striking is that even with this common goal of, get rid of the colonizers, the how of it varied so much.
A whole continent of contrasts.
Absolutely. You have situations like the Gold Coast becoming Ghana in 57, led by Kwame Nkrumah. They achieve independence through diplomacy, negotiation.
Which, in and of itself, pretty amazing.
Oh, absolutely. But then, flip the script and you have Algeria. Their fight for independence from France. Brutal. An 8-year war, hundreds of thousands dead. It's a stark reminder that the end of empire didn't automatically mean the end of bloodshed.
Two very different paths, same destination. Makes you wonder, though, if those different paths, if they impacted what came after independence.
Excellent point, and it's something Hobsbawm digs into. He argues that how independence was won, it had huge consequences for these new nations, both politically and economically.
So it wasn't just about getting to independence. It was about the terms on which that independence was won.
Precisely. And those terms, whether they were negotiated peacefully or won through this violent struggle, they often shaped the relationship between the former colony and the colonizer for, well, decades after.
It's like a messy divorce, isn't it?
Yeah.
The way you split up, it impacts how you co-parent, so to speak.
Right. And with decolonization, those lingering tensions, they played out on this global stage, influencing everything from Cold War alliances to, economic policies, even cultural exchanges.
It's amazing to think that even though we're talking about decades ago, those ripples from this period, they're still being felt today.
Oh, absolutely. We can't understand the world as it is now without understanding that legacy of colonialism, the ways it shaped global politics, economics, even how different cultures interact. It's all connected.
It's one thing to talk about, these big historical forces, but it hits different when you think about how it played out for actual people, right? Hobsbawm doesn't let us forget that human side of things.
Not at all. He brings in these really specific examples that they highlight how complicated this whole era was. Even when independence was achieved peacefully, relatively speaking, like in India, the aftershocks were still massive.
Yeah, the partition of India and Pakistan, that's the perfect example. So easy to just say, okay, independence on paper, but the reality on the ground, it was just messier.
And way more tragic than a lot of people realize, I think. Hobsbawm, he argues that the partition, while it was presented as this, necessary separation, it was actually fueled by the British Empire's own playbook, divide and rule, they called it. They'd been using release tensions, which were already there, to maintain control for, centuries. But by doing so, they created this powder keg that, it exploded once they left.
It's kind of a chilling thought, right? Even in their exit, colonial powers, they could still sow the seeds for future conflict. Makes you really question what a clean break even means in this context.
It really does. And it gets to something Hobsbawm brings up again and again. Decolonization. It wasn't just about, okay, get rid of the colonial officials, get rid of their institutions. It was about dismantling these really deep-seated systems of power, of inequality that were woven into the fabric of these societies.
Systems that, let's be honest, were often built on the backs of, the colonized people themselves. Hobsbawm talks about how these colonial economies, they were intentionally structured to benefit the colonizers, even if it meant hurting everyone else.
Totally. He uses this phrase, dependent development, which is such a great way to put it. He's describing how these economies, they were set up to just churn out raw materials for export, right? Instead of actually developing industries, diversifying things that could actually support the local population long term.
So even when these countries, they finally get political independence, they're still stuck in these exploitative economic relationships, almost like an economic echo of colonialism, you know what I mean?
Exactly. They were free, but on whose terms? And those economic inequalities, they were often tied to the racial and social hierarchies that had been put in place during colonial rule. So even after the colonizers physically left, those inequalities became this breeding ground for more instability, more conflict.
It's like you escape a burning building, which is amazing, right? But you escape into a maze. Freedom, without a clear path forward, it's its own kind of prison.
Wow, that's a powerful way to put it. And that's exactly why it's so important that we don't just stop at the headlines of decolonization. We have to look at these long-term consequences, the stuff that's harder to talk about.
Consequences that we're still dealing with today, right? I mean, it's impossible to look at the world, the way wealth is distributed, the conflicts that are still going on, even just how different cultures interact, and not see the fingerprints of colonialism all over it.
I completely agree. Hobsbawm, he wants us to confront those uncomfortable truths head on. He's saying that to truly understand the world today, with all its inequalities, the way everything's connected, we have to grapple with this legacy.
Which is what makes this whole conversation so important, right? It's not just history. It's this lens through which we can hopefully understand the present a little bit better and maybe, just maybe, create a future that's a little more just.
Well said. And what I appreciate about Hobsbawm, he's not giving us easy answers. He's encouraging us to sit with these complexities, the nuances, the stuff that makes us uncomfortable, the stuff that often gets ignored in those simpler narratives we tell about the past.
It's a call to action, really, for all of us.
Ah,
Keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.
exactly. Because that process of decolonization, I mean, both literally in terms of countries, but also just on a larger scale, it's still happening. It's about dismantling those systems of power, of inequality, wherever we find them, no matter what they look like.
So, to everyone listening, as we wrap up this deep dive into Eric Hobsbawm's The Age of Extremes, we'll leave you with this. Keep exploring these ideas, keep questioning those assumptions we often take for granted, and most importantly, keep making those connections between the past and the world around us today. Because this story, the story of decolonization, it's not over. It's still being written.